President Putin of Russia continues to adopt a harsher tone against the United States. He's accusing Washington of trying to protract the Ukraine conflict, stir the situation, and cause confrontations across the planet. Now, one instance that he cites is a recent visit by the U.S. House Speaker to Taiwan that Putin argues was a purposeful strategy aimed at destabilizing the region. The Russian president blames the U.S. for disrespecting the sovereignty of other countries. Welcome to the Spotlight. I'm your host, Behrouz Najafi, and these are our guests in this episode of the program. Spokesman of the LaRouche Organization, Harley Schlanger, joining us from Potsdam, Germany. Also with us is the former UN weapons inspector, Scott Ritter. He is in Bethlehem, New York. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Good to have you with us. Now let's go to Harley. To start, let's first discuss the factors and reasons that have pushed the Kremlin to adopt such a highly critical position of the U.S. policies worldwide.
Well, it's very obvious that the Pelosi visit was designed to create increased tension, especially with the discussion going on of the U.S. pulling together a kind of Asian NATO, whether it's the Quad trying to bring India into it, the agreement between the US, the UK, and Australia for nuclear submarines, the constant threats to China, accusing China of destabilizing the region. And more importantly, I think, is the anger that was created by the meeting in February of this year between President Putin and President Xi of China, where they signed a wide-ranging agreement, part of which was on military cooperation, but was primarily on economic cooperation. The concern from the Americans is that they're losing their global hegemony, and they see China and Russia as the main reason for that.
Okay. Now, Scott, President Putin accusing the U.S. of trying to destabilize and provoke conflicts in different parts of the world. Do you see eye to eye with him? I mean, with all the issues that the U.S. is facing, both on home turf and internationally, is it able to stomach it all?
Well, I mean, there's a question of what are they doing and what are they able to do? What do they want to do and what are they able to do?
Right.
Look, there's no question that the United States provoked a confrontation, a conflict in Ukraine. No question. There's literally no debate about it. It was our irresponsible push for the expansion of NATO, combined with a counter reset policy. I mean, I remind everybody of the reset policy that was implemented by, or at least attempted to be implemented by, the Obama administration in 2009, the famous or infamous red button. Change, promote the political fortunes of Dmitry Medvedev and sink Vladimir Putin. When that didn't work, the United States went into overdrive to destabilize Vladimir Putin, supporting people like Navalny, bringing about the 2014 Maidan coup, and pushing for the expansion of NATO. So the war that's taking place in Ukraine was a war that was provoked and initiated by the United States. Now we see similar behavior with the United States vis-a-vis Taiwan right now. China has made it clear what its red lines are. And that is, while it would prefer to have a peaceful unification of Taiwan with China, it will not tolerate any move toward independence, whether articulated by the Taiwanese government or through the behavior of other nations treating Taiwan as if it were an independent nation. 3 consecutive congressional delegations, with Nancy Pelosi in the middle, have gone to Taiwan and are treating Taiwan as if they were a nation that was independent. We could say, oh, we're not, it's a one China policy. Our actions speak louder than words. And if there is going to be a conflict over Taiwan, it's a conflict that the United States has initiated, not China.
Okay, I was just going to come to that point. Now, Harley, the Russian president argues that Pelosi visit Taiwan was a thoroughly planned provocation, and he argues that Washington wants to drag China into a war over Taiwan. Now, if so, what goal is the U.S. pursuing by wanting to do that?
Well, I think there are two aspects to it. The United States is not prepared to fight a war against China. It's clear that if you listen to people like Admiral Richard of the Stratcom and others, they're trying to come up with a strategy to combat China, but they don't really have one. And the war games that are being conducted by the Pentagon show that the U.S. would lose in a war over Taiwan with China. So I'm not sure they really want a war with China, but they're playing a game of brinksmanship. Now, it's a little bit beyond what they're doing in Ukraine is beyond that. They're actually organizing NATO and the other forces involved, especially the United Kingdom, to degrade Russia, to drain Russia of resources, of economic power, and military. And this is an extremely dangerous game that's being played, but it's being played from the standpoint of maintaining the illusion of the U.S. as the sole superpower. And I think that's something which has eroded and is about to be exposed as a fraud.
Scott, how do you look at that? I mean, there's some analysts who are saying that the U.S. is trying to do to China what it did to Russia to try and push it into a war with Taiwan, maybe not directly engaging itself, but starting that war. That China is insisting also that Taiwan is a red line and warning the U.S. against such things.
Well, I concur with the gentleman's assessment that the United States can't. And this isn't just him or other analysts. The Pentagon knows this. This is one of the reasons why General Milley told Joe Biden, hey, tell Pelosi it's not a good time to go. Right. Because if a conflict was initiated, the United States was in no position to do it. Yeah, we moved a carrier here. We had to Japan. It's a token force at best. I think the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, in his posture statement, has summed it up more succinctly than anybody else. The United States Navy and the Marine Corps, through its amphibious forces, are married to a legacy system that's more appropriate for World War II and not today. That if you load thousands of people on ships, big ships, and sell them towards coastlines that are defended by highly accurate long-range ballistic missiles, all these ships will be sunk. The only thing the United States has in the Pacific is the Pacific Fleet. And the Pacific Fleet would be sunk in a heartbeat if it sought to confront China in the vicinity of Taiwan. The Pentagon knows this, but the United States has no plan B. We're working to try and create a Pacific NATO. We have the Quad, and again we have the AUKUS, the Australian, United Kingdom, United States alliance. But these are powerless. These are paper tigers. There is no real military counterbalance to China, so it would be foolish to start a war that we know we can't win, and yet we have no other options. We don't have any economic plan. We don't have a diplomatic plan of geopolitical isolation. All we have is a Pacific Fleet. Right. And so we sail it around and pretend we're tougher than we really are.
Okay. Now, Harley, Putin is also accusing the U.S. of trying to prolong the war in Ukraine. And why should the U.S. want to prolong that war, and how would it benefit, from a protracted war in Ukraine?
Well, keep in mind what the defense secretary from Raytheon, General Austin, said in his meetings in Ramstein, Germany earlier this year. The goal is to weaken Russia. The U.S. from the beginning, as Scott Ritter said earlier, had a strategy of provoking a war, of using the NATO expansion eastward after it was promised that this would not happen. The U.S. has broken promise after promise. And I think you really have to come back to this question of what is the view of the people who are making this policy. Their view is that the U.S. is the only superpower. This goes back to the neoconservatives, the crowd around Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and others, who asserted after the fall of the Soviet Union that the U.S. is now the sole superpower and will set the rules. This is what Blinken is talking about when he talks about a rules-based order. So President Putin is absolutely right that the U.S. is trying to prolong the war to bleed Russia. And this is clear in the reports that there are people in Ukraine who have been willing to concede that Ukraine will not go into NATO, that they maybe should go back and revisit Minsk, although I think that's not very likely. But the U.S. is telling them, no, we'll keep the weapons coming, and Zelensky's public posture is keep arming us, keep the flow of weapons. And now there's another problem, which is Ukraine is bankrupt. Ukraine was just downgraded to a lowest status by Standard & Poor's and Fitch's rating service because their debt is, quote, in distress, unquote, which basically means they're in default. So it's a losing proposition for the U.S., but the intent is to do as much as possible to damage Russia.
Okay. Scott, speaking of Ukraine, we also had reports of repeated shelling at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. It's raising fears of a nuclear disaster. It could endanger the entire Europe. And Russia is saying that Ukraine is doing this. Ukraine is blaming Russia for that. So who do you think is behind this, and what's the purpose?
Well, we know who's behind it. I mean, first of all, the facial absurdity of Russia shelling Russian troops should be dismissed by any media organization who receives a report that says that. But more importantly, President Zelensky has now admitted that it is the Ukrainians who are in fact using artillery fires against Russian positions in and around Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So Ukraine is doing this. Ukraine is committing a horrific crime against humanity because the potential of something bad happening is real. It may not be, a certainty. Look, there's no doubt that this facility was constructed to a standard that can withstand artillery fire. The reinforced concrete of the nuclear reactor shielding and everything is such it can take a hit from an airplane, from artillery. That's not the problem. The problem is if you take out the power supplies, if you take out the cooling systems, the radiation safety systems, the backup generators. If these get destroyed in artillery strike, and so far all of them have been damaged. I mean, we're not into hypotheticals now. They've all been damaged. They've been repaired. Right. But an artillery strike that takes them all out could lead to the kind of conflagration that we saw with Chernobyl or Chernobyl-like. And this would threaten not only the people in the region, but the entire, Europe and indeed the world. So Zelensky's admitting doing this, and yet the West continues to support his efforts. The whole purpose of this is to get the West to impose some sort of international force, a peacekeeping force, to do to Russia what the Ukrainian army can't do, that is to take back territory. It's insanity, though. I mean, why the West? If Russia was doing this, they'd be called an international pariah, and the Russians who were perpetrating this would be charged with crimes against humanity. Zelensky has just admitted that he is carrying out a crime against humanity, and yet the West continues to be complicit in this crime by coddling him and supporting his policy objectives. It's a very dangerous situation.
Okay. Harley, Russian President recently also said, and I'm quoting him, that we also see that the collective West is seeking to extend its bloc system to the Asia-Pacific region, similarly to NATO in Europe. And for this purpose, bellicose military political alliances are being formed, such as AUKUS and the others, and Scott called AUKUS and others as paper tigers. So is the U.S. and NATO allies, are they trying to change the global security architecture by putting together new military alliances?
Well, they're trying to maintain the idea of a rules-based order where the rules come from Washington and London and Brussels to a lesser extent. And they realize they're in a weak position to do this. The economies of the West are very fragile. I mean, one of the things that President Putin has also been pointing to is the West is committing economic suicide with the sanctions policy. Right. I'm here in Germany where we're talking about having a situation of blackouts, of tripling of electricity prices this winter, cold, terrible winter for the German people. And yet Chancellor Scholz is continuing to go along with the Washington-London policy of backing Zelensky. So I think the strategy of if you can call it that, look, the Quad is not going to work. Blinken just went to India and tried to get the Indians to break with Russia. And the Indians are not going to do that. The idea that India would be brought into an anti-Russian alliance won't work. There's an effort by Blinken then to bring up something with Pakistan, and the Pakistanis are not going to break with China. So whatever their intention is, oh, and by the way, let me add, they're trying to move in more forces into Africa, where there are problems of terrorism, but they're not concerned with terrorism. They're concerned with the Chinese-Russian economic development packages that are going into African countries. So there's an attempt to extend NATO into a global NATO.
Okay. Scott, you talked about AUKUS and the others. You called them paper tigers. So why should the U.S. Want to boost them? What's the purpose?
Well, I mean, they didn't used to be paper tigers, especially NATO. NATO used to be a vibrant military alliance back in the Cold War, but it's allowed its capabilities to degrade over time, primarily because it's lost mission focus. It doesn't, Afghanistan was not a logical mission for NATO to undertake, and they saw their military capabilities deteriorate rapidly. And now, they're confronting Russia, and you have people like Stoltenberg trying to breathe life into past glory with slides, with words, but you got to back it up with reality, and NATO doesn't have the wherewithal right now to build a military capable of doing that which it claims it wants to do. The same thing in Europe. The Japanese are working on breaking free of their constitutional constraints, but the bottom line is Japan is not a military, does not possess a military capable of meaningful power projection outside of its borders. South Korea is solely focused on defending its own soil. Australia is a small country. New Zealand's a small country with small militaries that are incapable of doing anything without the United States. And I think we've already pointed out that the United States has a fleet. That's about it when it comes to the Pacific.
Harley, there's also this fact that Russia and the U.S. have stopped cooperation in a number of fields like strategic arms, the START Treaty, space, etc. So what will be the likely ramifications of Russia and the U.S. perpetuating the war of words and also where you see lack of dialogue? I mean, what's the likelihood that this could end up in military confrontation in hottest spots like Ukraine, Syria, or even Taiwan?
Well, the Russians are saying that we're moving towards an absolute diplomatic break between the United States and Russia. As you point out, a lot of the talking shops that exist between the two have been shut down. And especially with the need for new arms limitation talks, the renewal of the INF and so on, that's going nowhere. There's, in fact, no intent for that. The only area where there's still cooperation is in space, and that's primarily because of the weakness of the United States. The Russians are trying to continue that, but it's very hard to negotiate with a partner whose leaders are saying Russia is a terrorist state. You know, the US Senate just voted 100-0, declaring Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. When in fact, the US is arming the actual terrorist state. I mean, even Amnesty International pointed out that the Ukrainians are violating international law by using civilians as a shield. So look, what has to happen is that there has to be an agreement which starts with the idea that we do need a new strategic and financial architecture in the world, not based on US and NATO military power, but based on cooperation for economic development. That should have been the lesson from Afghanistan, but unfortunately, it's not been learned.
All right, now, Scott, given the circumstances, how would you depict the prospect of global peace and security as tensions, keep rising between the U.S. and Russia?
I mean, actually, I think the prospects are pretty darn good. And the reason why I say that is, for the past, 70, 80 years, the world has been under the, unilateral jurisdiction of the United States in the post-World War II environment, the rules-based international order. There was, we had the Cold War where the world was divided between, ostensible democracies and communism. But we won the Cold War. And then for the decade of the 90s, we had absolute power. It went away after 9/11. We saw the inherent weakness of the United States, but now we see the world in transition. And one only has to take a look at who's rallying behind the so-called autocracies, Russia and China. It's everybody but the United States and NATO and Japan, Australia and New Zealand. It's the United States that's becoming increasingly isolated. And with this isolation comes weakness. And with this weakness comes the inability to project meaningful military power, which was America's ultimate advantage over people. So I think the isolation of the West, the Europeans' economic collapse, America's isolation, combined with the growing power and relevance of the BRICS, of a trans-Eurasian economic union, things of this nature, I think we're looking actually for a period of stability, because the rest of the world has learned the hard lessons. You don't bring about peace and prosperity by the pointy end of a sword. You do it by trading with people, by entering into meaningful relationships based upon trust and common objectives. That's what Russia and China are doing. And it's the United States that's being isolated. And eventually, I believe Europe is eventually going to break away because they have no choice. They committed economic suicide. And the United States will be left all alone. And at that point in time, hopefully, the American people will recognize the sins of the past and elect leadership that will want to rejoin the international community as a responsible nation.
Okay, Harley, we have 1 minute for your final thoughts regarding prospect for global security.
I absolutely think that what Scott just said is extremely important. If you look at the new institutions emerging like the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we're seeing a revival of the non-aligned movement. And this is the way the world is going. The Global South is rejecting the rules-based order. The South African foreign minister told Blinken, "You can't bully us, we're a sovereign nation." So the question is, when will this get across to the people in the US Senate, in the Congress, on Wall Street, the people in the Pentagon, the intelligence community? And that's what the Schiller Institute and my organization is doing, is trying to put forward the idea of global, mutually beneficial economic cooperation as an alternative to this idea of a rules-based order.
Okay, on that note, we come to the end of this show. Thank you, my guests, spokesman of the LaRouche Organization, Harley Schlanger in Potsdam, Germany, former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter in Bethlehem, New York. Thank you for watching this episode of Spotlight. I've been your host, Behrouz Najaf, and I'll see you next time.